Welcome to the very first segment of Fantasy Big Beautiful Bill. I'm going to talk about what was passed and what should have happened if it was actually going to be in service to we the people. I suggest you share this with your favorite elected official. First segment, corporate tax policy. In order to fully understand corporate tax policy, we do have to rewind the clock all the way to the 80s, where Ronald Reagan did 2 corporate tax cuts. Then in the early aughts, George W. Bush did another corporate tax cut. Then in 2017, Donald Trump did the biggest corporate tax cut of all, taking the 15% to 35% marginal tax rate, that 35% only on revenues of 10 million plus, and smashing it all down to a flat corporate rate of 21%. And then, of course, the big beautiful bill that just passed has added another $1 trillion in tax considerations for corporations. Just estimating the modern bills, starting at the beginning of the TCJA's budget window in 2018 and going through the end of the big beautiful bill's budget window in 2034, we the people are stand to lose about $3.3 trillion in corporate tax revenue, about $1.3 trillion from the original TCJA budget window, and another $2 trillion or so in the ongoing permanent tax cuts from the TCJA and the new tax provisions from the big beautiful bill. And I can hear the corporate tax cut apologists now. Kate, you don't understand. Any corporate increase hurts labor. The voodoo words they like to use are burden to labor, or the theory that a percentage point increase in corporate taxes has a certain offsetting decrease to wages. And some of these estimates are wild. The Tax Foundation uses anything from a 50 to 100% assumption of burden to labor. And they will all say this is empirically demonstrable in the literature. You know I'm an empirical girl. I love that data. But there's also a really good saying. There's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. Or as I like to say, sometimes those stats can bite you in the ass. What is true is you will find plenty of studies and publications that say that there is a high burden to labor from any corporate tax increase. But there are these fun little studies called meta-regression analyses. And without getting too technical, they are the studies for the studies, telling you why studies might demonstrate the results that they do. In 2022, a meta-regression analysis was done on studies that analyzed the relationship between corporate taxes and economic growth, and found that a paper was 2.7 to 3 times more likely to be published if it demonstrated a positive effect on economic benefit from corporate cuts. Which is important because the rationale that corporate tax increases depress wages is the inverse rationale that is used to propel that theory. Once this analysis corrected for that bias, they found that there was a likelihood that corporate tax cuts lead to absolutely no economic growth whatsoever, which means that the corresponding theory of corporate tax increases having a high burden on wages may also have absolutely no relationship, or certainly no significant relationship. A different meta-regression analysis, specifically looking at the relationship between corporate taxes and wages, found that a 1% corporate income tax increase was found to decrease wages by anywhere from 0.1 to maybe 0.2%. Not even close to a 50, 75, and certainly not a 100% burden to labor. Now you might think, this is a bunch of theoretical mumbo-jumbo. Okay, then let's look at the data from the last 40 years, starting with the Reagan corporate tax cuts. The rate of both productivity and wages increased faster when corporate taxes were higher. Productivity and wages used to have a relatively close relationship until the 80s, when they made a dramatic split. Wages remained flat while productivity soared. After the Bush tax cuts, there was high post-tax profits and low investment. I'm sorry, I am being a little bit remiss. Not all wages remained flat or decreased after these tax cuts. CEOs and highly compensated employees saw unprecedented wage increases. The proportion of tax revenue coming from corporations versus individuals has only gotten lower. And stock buybacks, the mechanism by which a company artificially inflates its earnings per share by gobbling up its own stock with those profits that are not being taxed, that's increased astronomically. Stop being Jedi mind tricked by our corporate overlords and the politicians that they purchase. Corporate tax cuts do not lead to economic growth, and they certainly do not increase your paycheck. So what should the policy be? Well, I think if Democrats are willing to walk the talk and stop being beholden to those exact same corporate overlords, I think they should advocate for a marginal rather than flat tax rate again, meaning there's different buckets for different levels of businesses. Before the TCJA, the lowest one was 15% for revenues up to $50,000. You're welcome, small businesses. The top line tax before the TCJA was 35%, but that's much too low. It needs to be at least 50%. We could pay for all the social program cuts that we just made and start addressing our national deficit. And that's just dealing with the corporations. We haven't even talked about high net worth individuals yet. That's it for this week's fantasy segment. Tell me what you liked, tell me what you want to do next, and make sure your elected officials know that you know.